Welcome to the remarkable letters of the female convicts. Today we look at some of the extraordinary letters that managed to come back to England from the convicts who arrived, particularly on the first and second fleets in the penal colony of New South Wales. We'll also look at how these extraordinary women were able to cope with great hardship and later flourish. Not many of these letters survive, but they give us a very vivid and unique account of the penal settlement. In August 1786, the government of the United Kingdom was forced to act on the issue of prison overcrowding, which was an unwanted product of the great social upheaval caused by the Industrial Revolution. A symbol of the overcrowded prison system were the prison hulks. These were decommissioned naval vessels used by Britain from the late 1700s to house convicts in notoriously harsh, unsanitary conditions. These rotting vessels, often on the Thames River or Portsmouth, held thousands of convicts. But even these had filled up, and concerns about rioting and disease had spread in the local townships and communities. Thomas Townshend, 1st Viscount Sydney, the Secretary of State for the Home Office, led the decision to establish a penal colony called New South Wales to be located on the other side of the world at a place the English called Botany Bay, which the First Nations Gwagal people called Kamai.
Been some excellent books written about convict women, such as The Tin Ticket, The Heroic Journey of Australia's Convict Women by Deborah Swift. Deborah Swift writes that it's estimated that 164,000 convicts were shipped to Australia between 1788 and 1868 under the British government's Transportation Act. Approximately 25,000 of these convicts were women who were normally charged with petty crimes such as stealing bread. Deborah Swift goes on to say that female convicts were predominantly young, single women who had been domestic servants or backgrounds such as apprenticeship. The majority of female convicts were first-time offenders sentenced to transportation. It's estimated that about 1 in 3 convicts, men and women, were literate, so they could read or write. This was significant in terms of the surviving letters that we have.
The first fleet arrived at what we call Sydney Cove on the 26th of January 1788, the site chosen by Governor Phillip to establish the new penal settlement. The First Nations people, the Gadigal, called Sydney Cove Warrain, a significant place for fishing, camping and cultural ceremonies. Wary of these new arrivals, they largely stayed away from the encampments. The first days and weeks of the landing must have been extremely difficult for the female convicts. Being small in number, they had to deal with a whole range of sexual advances from both convict and soldier alike. Stores and supplies were few and soon became a major issue within weeks really of their settlement, particularly around, well, mainly food, but also clothing and bedding and shelter, as we will see. They must have also felt the weight of exile and remoteness very heavily, particularly those who were young and far away from their homes. To heighten their sense of isolation, the transport ships that had brought them out began to return back to England, either directly or indirectly. The first ships to actually arrive back in England arrived at the end of March 1789 at the deep water port of Falmouth in Cornwall. I think the Prince of Wales was the first one to arrive, and it was a very difficult journey back to England. The ships brought back news of the penal settlement and Governor Arthur Phillip's urgent request for more supplies and food, which would take a long time to reach the new penal settlement of New South Wales. First letter we're going to talk about appeared in a number of newspapers in the first week in June, and one of the first, if not the first, was the Diary of Woodfall's Register. We read that the letter from Sydney Cove is written by a female pen.
I take the first opportunity that has been given us to acquaint you with our disconsolate situation in this solitary waste of the creation. Our passage, you may have heard by the first ships, was tolerably favourable, but the inconveniences since suffered for want of shelter, bedding, etc., are not to be imagined by any stranger. However, we have now 2 streets, if 4 rows of the most miserable huts you can possibly conceive of deserve that name.
The writer goes on to talk about the harsh conditions in the colony, and we realise that it is most likely that she is a convict because her letters are checked.
Several women who became pregnant on the voyage are since left by their partners, who have returned to England, are not likely even here to form any fresh connections. In short, everyone is so taken up with their own misfortunes that they have no pity to bestow on others. All our letters are examined by an officer, but a friend takes this for me privately. The ships sail tonight.
We also hope to get some tea from China, although I would have liked coffee. Although the first ships reached England in March 1789, it would not be until June 1790 that Arthur Phillip would see another ship from England sail through the heads of Sydney Harbour. By that stage, the settlement was in dire straits, and guard and convict alike had begun to feel that they had been forgotten by the country from whence they had come. Finally, on 3rd of June 1790, a ship appeared on the Sydney heads. Marine officer Watkin Tench recorded what happened next. I was sitting in my hut musing on our fate when a confused clamour in the street drew my attention. I opened my door and saw several women with children in their arms running in to and fro with distracted looks, congratulating each other. A few minutes completed our wishes and we found ourselves on board the Lady Juliana transport with 225 of our countrywomen whom crime or misfortune had condemned to exile. We continued to ask 1,000 questions. Letters, letters was the cry. We now heard for the first time of our sovereign's illness and his happy restoration to health. The French Revolution of 1789, with all the attendant circumstances of that wonderful and unexpected event, succeeded to amaze us. The new settlement was saved with supplies arriving and a recognition from England that the colony would be ongoing, albeit as a penal colony. However, the next lot of ships that was to arrive with more convicts was to lead to a great deal of scandal at the neglect and illness that occurred on board the ships of the Second Fleet. And a woman convict would once again write about this issue.
Oh, if you had but seen the shocking sight of the poor creatures that came out in the 3 ships, it would make your heart bleed. They were almost dead, very few could stand, and they were obliged to fling them as you would goods, and hoist them out of the ship. They were so feeble, and they died 10 or 12 a day when they first landed. The governor was very angry and scolded the captains a great deal, and I heard intended to write to London about it. He said it was murdering them.
The letter appeared on the 3rd of August 1791 in the Diary or Woodfall's Register. I believe that the journalist William Woodfall and his brother were very important in providing these letters and publishing them. They appear to have published them first, both the one from the First Fleet and the Second Fleet, from what I can tell. And it's interesting that they knew a man, a lord, a peer of the realm called Lord George Gordon, who was a real political loose cannon and was actually in Newgate prison at the time of the convicts of the Second Fleet leaving. And what is interesting about this is that they say in one of their newspapers that he had provided them with letters from Botany Bay. And then we also see that he was against transportation to Botany Bay and that he had been in Newgate and had met many of these women who would go out to be convicts. Particularly, this is recorded by John Nichol, who says that he used to collect a stipend from Lord George Gordon to give to at least one of the women convicts on board the Lady Juliana. So, look, it's very hard in history to say that's a definite. We can't say that's definite evidence, but I think there's quite a potential strong connection in terms of the way that those letters reached the press from the penal colony of New South Wales, from Sydney Cove, basically. People began to realise that the climate of New South Wales was very good, temperate. Children tended to grow up much healthier than they may have in England. And they realised that they may have a future for themselves here after they were released from their sentences. In any case, they didn't have much choice. Very few could afford the trip back to England. So it was therefore something of a realisation over time that there was a life here despite the fact that it was a penal colony. There was also, alongside that, trade growing and agriculture was growing, and there was a reason to find new opportunities in this penal settlement. Here is a short clip from the documentary The Floating Brothel, which talks about how the convict women from the Lady Juliana, many of them went on to thrive in the new colony.
That the colony has not been forgotten. It's the promise that life is going to get better.
Within a few years, the women helped turn the colony around. Though they would still be outnumbered by men for over a century, the proportion of women began to climb. With women came families, and with families came civilization. But the most tenacious of the women of the Lady Juliana brought something more, a sense of enterprise.
As usual, I've run out of time. Some other notable convict writers were Margaret Catchpole, who arrived in the colony as a convict, I think in 1801, after a very daring attempt to rescue her boyfriend from jail, including stealing a horse and riding it. Once she arrived in the colony, she really settled in. She wrote to home, and she actually continued to live and work in New South Wales until she died. You can read about Margaret Catchpole in the online Australian Dictionary of Biography. Finally, from Limerick to Campbelltown to Detroit, Tasmanian historian Dr. Meredith Hodgson guides us through the remarkable life of Eliza Williams, the convict letter writer. Eliza Williams continued to stay in contact with the family that had looked after her in Hobart many years after, even when she was a middle-aged woman in Detroit. Thanks for listening. I have a fairly eclectic collection of history videos of Australian history and world history. So it would be great if you feel like it, if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Bye.